With summer just around the corner, you may or may not have heard of the story of a man in Cape Cod who was swallowed by a whale just about over a year ago. According to the Cape Cod Times, a lobster diver named Michael had just entered the water for his second dive of the day when he was swallowed by a whale. He describes the incident as, all of a sudden, I felt this huge shove, and the next thing I knew, it was completely black. Now, does this story sound familiar to you? That's because the story has biblical ties. This story seems almost identical to the story of Jonah and the whale from the Bible. Michael was not the first person to be swallowed by a whale. As in the story, a man named Jonah was swallowed by a huge fish, presumably to be a whale. But unlike Michael, Jonah was not fishing for lobsters. He was thrown overboard by sailors on a ship. They took Jonah and threw him overboard. Jonah chapter 1 verse 15. Once he was thrown overboard, then God had assigned a huge fish to swallow Jonah. Jonah chapter 1 verse 17. Similar to Michael's experience of being swallowed. While in the whale, Michael had pondered, saying, I thought to myself, there's no way I'm getting out of here. I'm done. I'm dead. All I could think of was my boys. They're 12 and 15 years old, he had said. This is similar to what Jonah had done when he was inside the whale. Then Jonah prayed to God from the belly of the fish. Jonah chapter 2 verse 1. According to the Bible, Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah chapter 1 verse 17. While Michael had estimated that he was inside the whale for about 30 to 40 seconds. After 3 days and 3 nights that Jonah was inside the fish, then God spoke to the fish and it vomited up Jonah on the seashore. Jonah chapter 2 verse 10. And after 30 to 40 seconds, Michael says that I saw light, and he started throwing his head side to side, and the next thing I knew, I was outside, in the water. This movement to me sounds a lot like the fish that had vomited Jonah out of its stomach. But is it really true that a human can fit inside a whale's mouth? According to scientists, they say that a human most definitely could fit inside a whale's mouth. According to Google, the size of a humpback whale's mouth can reach up to 10 feet. So a whale could definitely fit a human inside there. So this implies that the story in the Bible is in fact real, as we have seen that it could happen. But I encourage you to read the story of Jonah as well as the article from the Cape Cod Times. The resemblance is uncanny. I will link both in the description of this episode. So last week I had discussed how the story of Jonah and the whale could be proven true since a similar situation happened over a year ago to a man in Cape Cod. But what about other stories in the Bible? Can they also be proven true? The answer to that is yes. Today I will be discussing one of the 10 plagues in Egypt, found in the book of Exodus. Specifically, I'll be talking about the plague of blood. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. Exodus chapter 7, verse 17 and 18. What is being described here is what we call today a red tide. Red tides are a collection of algae packed so densely the plants discolor the water to a reddish tone. They are also known as harmful algal blooms, or HABs. They occur when colonies of algae, simple plants that live in the sea and freshwater, grow out of control, while producing toxic or harmful effects on people, fish, shellfish, marine mammals, and birds. The human illnesses caused by these harmful algal blooms, though rare, can be debilitating or even fatal. This is exactly what seems to have caused the Nile River to turn the color of blood. We could assume this by the way God describes what will happen once the river turns a blood color. It says the fish will die and the river will stink, as well as the water becoming not safe to drink. This is all stuff that happens when a red tide hits the water. As I previously stated, red tides can become fatal to marine life living in the waters of the tide. The tides can also cause harmful drinking water, as well as a musty smell, as the Bible states in Exodus. So it can be concluded that the blood plague in Exodus can be proven true, as it seems to have just been a red tide that God had sent among the river. It seems as if the Bible makes mention of various types of animals, including fish and birds, but doesn't specifically specify specific species of marine creatures such as sharks or the octopus, just to name a few. But why is this the case? Why doesn't the Bible mention sea creatures such as sharks? You have to remember that there was no diving back then, so people only knew what was found around the surface of the ocean in the epipelagic zone. According to Oceana.org, the epipelagic zone is home to all sorts of iconic animals, like whales, sharks, dolphins, billfishes, tunas, and many other groups. But even with people's ability to observe these species with their own eyes, it was quite difficult for humans at the time to be able to identify certain animals. The only way that specific species of marine life were categorized was by the absence or presence of fins and scales. This can be found in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 9 through 10. This is primarily due to the lack of scientific knowledge humans had at the time. As science advances, we now have the ability to not only categorize, but identify specific species of marine organisms beyond the epipelagic zone. But I bet if the Bible was written at a different point in time, where marine science had taken shape, specific creatures would have been mentioned. 4 of Jesus' disciples were fishermen. Fishing was a common trade around the Sea of Galilee where Jesus lived. Fishermen usually casted their nets at night to avoid the scorching heat of the day. In the morning, they sorted through their haul and sold their spoils at the fish gate or fish market. Fish were the food of common people, so the demand for fish was high, and the market was large. Some of their everyday duties could have ranged anywhere from maintaining the equipment to sorting fish. But why fishermen? Well, in order to catch as many fish as possible, fishermen have to have a good eye and understanding of the surrounding waters. They have to understand which species to target, as well as where and how to catch them. Some common fish species that can be found in the Sea of Galilee include Tilapia galilea, Kinnerzet sardine, and Binny barbels, which is a fish commonly used for Sabbath meals and feasts. Because of this, the disciples of Jesus could have been considered to have similar attributes to an ichthyologist, in which one studies all aspects of fish biology, including anatomy, behavior, and environment of fishes, as well as how fishes interact with other organisms. In our modern-day world, an ichthyologist can sometimes be considered a marine biologist. In some ways, you can say that these fishermen who happen to also be disciples of Jesus believed in science. Even if the formal term of scientist or science had been used at the time, these 4 men dedicated their lives to targeting and catching various fish species day in and day out, causing them to acquire great knowledge on the marine world around them. I would say that these men were some of the first followers of Jesus to believe in both science and God, and they for sure won't be the last. Did you know that the Bible accurately predicts a shipwreck? In Acts chapter 27, verse 39 to 44, we read about the Apostle Paul's journey to Rome, a trip full of danger and ending in dramatic shipwreck. Paul and his companions were sailing across the Mediterranean when they encountered a fierce storm that battered the ship for days. After 14 days of uncertainty, they spotted land. Desperate to survive, they tried to run the ship aground, but they hit a reef. The bow became stuck while the stern was torn apart by the waves, and a shipwreck unfolded that involved 276 people, soldiers, prisoners, and sailors. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Bible uses specific Greek words, dithyalasso and epigelo, to describe the events leading up to the shipwreck. Dithyalasso refers to the reef, and it means where the 2 seas meet. It could also describe either a sandbank or a shoal. Underwater hazards that can be really tough to spot, but are especially dangerous to ships. A sandbank is a large mass of sand deposited by waves or currents, while a shoal can be made up of sand, gravel, rocks, or other materials. Both are shallow, underwater features that pose major risks to ships, especially in low visibility or stormy conditions. Sandbanks are often formed in shallow water, where sand gets deposited, creating ridges or bars that can be partially or completely submerged. Depending on the tide, this makes them hard to detect. And if a ship strikes one, it can get stuck or even torn apart by the powerful waves. Shoals, on the other hand, can consist of a mix of sand, gravel, and rocks, and are just as hazardous. These underwater features, especially when formed where 2 currents meet, create unpredictable conditions that make navigation really dangerous. Now, understanding the science behind this shipwreck helps us picture the situation more clearly. The ship's structure, for example, plays a huge role in withstanding the power of the sea. The bow is built to cut through waves, but the stern is usually more vulnerable to damage, especially in rough seas. Waves themselves carry a tremendous amount of energy. When they hit a reef or sandbank, they can cause serious damage to a ship. If the ship runs aground, it gets driven onto the shore, and depending on how hard it hits, it can result in a catastrophic consequence. What's really cool is how the Bible's description lines up with what we know about shipwrecks and the forces of nature. Science and the Bible agree on the dangers sailors face, showing us that the events in Acts 27 weren't just a story. They reflected real, scientifically proven hazards at sea. If you found today's episode interesting, please feel free to share it with a friend. Have a blessed day. According to science, horseshoe crabs are living fossils existing long before the dinosaurs. They're often called living fossils due to their superficial resemblance to fossils dating back hundreds of millions of years. But does the Bible recognize living fossils such as the horseshoe crab? 100%, as the Bible states that sea creatures were created before any wild animal had ever existed. So God created the large sea animals. He created every living thing that moves in the sea. The sea is filled with these living things. Genesis 1:21. At this time, horseshoe crabs had to have been created. Then it states that a few days later that wild animals were created. So God made the wild animals, the tame animals, and all the small crawling animals to produce more of their own kind. God saw that this was good. Genesis 1:25. Here dinosaurs would have been created. The amount of time it took between the creation of sea creatures and wild animals was 1 day. But the Hebrew word for day doesn't suggest literal 24-hour days. It actually translates to a time period of unspecified length. The Bible also says that to the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. 2 Peter 3:8, meaning that the time between the creation of sea creatures and wild animals was thousands of years. So in conclusion, the Bible does support the idea that horseshoe crabs did in fact exist years before the dinosaurs, making them a living fossil. If you found today's episode interesting, please feel free to share with a friend. Today, we're diving into 2 of Jesus' miracles, the miracle of the loaves and fishes and the miraculous catch of fish. You might hear these stories and think, really? 5 loaves and 2 fish for 5,000 people? But let's look at some science that can actually explain how these events might have happened. First, we have the miracle of the loaves and fishes, which you can find in John chapter 6, verse 1 through 14. Jesus is surrounded by a massive crowd, and they're all hungry. He takes 5 loaves and 2 fish and somehow feeds everyone. So how is this possible? Well, researchers studying the Sea of Galilee discovered something called anoxia. This occurs when the oxygen levels in the water drop, causing fish to suffocate and float to the surface. Imagine being at a lake and suddenly seeing fish just floating there, ready to be caught. This phenomenon is real and happens today. So could it be that Jesus used this natural event to perform his miracle? It's definitely a possibility. Next, let's talk about the miraculous catch of fish, found in John chapter 21, verse 1 through 14. After Jesus rises from the dead, he helps his disciples catch 153 fish. And again, those low oxygen conditions could explain how they caught so many. When fish are floating at the surface, it's much easier to net them. This shows how nature can create the conditions for what we may think of as miracles, which is pretty cool. Now let's touch on the question of whether those fish would have been safe to eat. If the fish died from anoxia and were collected quickly, they might be safe for consumption. However, there are always health risks to consider. Fish can spoil quickly, and if they have been dead for too long, they could harbor bacteria or other contaminants. So while it's possible that the fish could be consumed safely, it's essential to be cautious. But what does this mean for those of you who may be skeptical? Well, this research suggests that there is a real scientific basis for these miracles. But I want to hear from you. Do you guys think that these miracles could have happened? Let me know in the comments below. What came first, the chicken or the egg? According to science, sharks are older than trees, with the earliest evidence of shark fossils dating back as far as 450 million years ago, which means that these creatures have been around at least 90 million years before trees. But does the Bible support this discovery? Well, according to the Bible, the ocean was created before trees. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered water he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees, on the land that bear fruit, with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. Genesis 1, 9 through 11. In the time that the ocean was created, sharks were most likely also created in that time as well. Although the Bible does state that sea creatures weren't created until after trees, the Bible does state in a few verses later that sea creatures were in fact created before trees. And God said, "Let the waters teem with living creatures, let the birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food." Genesis 1, 20, 21, and 29. So it can be concluded that the Bible does in fact support that sharks are older than trees.